Hello, and welcome to this public rally hosted by the Scottish Socialist Party. I'm Shirley Sampson. I'm active in the SSP's Glasgow South branch, and I serve on the party's executive committee. We're live across Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and we're making the case for an independent socialist Scotland, a modern democratic republic. In other words, a country that uses the powers that come with self-determination to transform the lives of Scotland's working class majority for the better. If you share that vision, please also share this live stream on whichever platform you're using. You can also use the comments to share your views, and we'll try to put some up on screen as we go along. In the next hour, we're going to address the most important question for pro-independence socialists in Scotland. The questions that are key to winning Scottish independence. The questions which the Yes movement has so far failed to answer. We'll be setting out the socialist case for independence and asking why, after all the chaos and uncertainty associated with Brexit and the pandemic, should working people want to fight for self-determination now? What will it take to persuade Scotland's working class majority to support independence? We also need to tackle what was the Achilles heel of the Yes movement in 2014, the economic case. And we'll take on one of the issues that split the SNP, which is that once there's a supermajority in Parliament and on the streets, how do we actually become an independent nation, given the Tories' determination to refuse a Section 30 request from Holyrood? Comrades, in spite of the bluster of SNP politicians, the rising inequality and ongoing crises caused by unelected Tory governments in Westminster, and even the expected pro-Indy majority in Parliament next week, the independence movement is yet to face up to the reality that right now, our opponents are more powerful than we are. Since 2014, the Yes Scotland movement has been marched down from the top of the hill and demobilised. That's because the SNP leadership has tried to dissipate the energy of the grassroots Yes movement and the urgency of its demand for independence by promising a referendum next year, or the year after, or maybe the year after that. At the moment, we don't have an organised movement that will be capable of securing independence when Johnson turns down Sturgeon's request for a Section 30 order. That's if she even ever asks for one. At the moment, there's no plan for what to do after the inevitable, expensive defeat in the UK Supreme Court. And most importantly of all, we still haven't persuaded a clear majority of Scots to back independence. So what does the persuasive case for independence sound like? Before we answer that question, I'm just going to take 1 minute, if you'll forgive me, for just a little bit of news that I want to introduce before we get going. Just in case you haven't heard, the EIS FELA lecturers' strike was won today, and it's hoped that the dispute at Forth Valley College will soon be resolved too. I'm very proud to say the SSP supported striking FE College lecturers throughout their struggle, and we congratulate them on their victory. So what does the persuasive case for independence sound like? Let's welcome first the Scottish Socialist Party's national spokesperson, Roisin McLaren. Roisin's part of the independence generation, but like so many, she isn't inspired by the SNP's pro-EU mania or its record in government, where it's presided over cuts and a precarious poverty pay economy. Roisin, what's the SSP's case for an independent socialist Scotland?
Thank you very much, Shirley. The Scottish Socialist Party has supported independence since our inception in 1998. We campaign for an independent socialist Scotland, a modern democratic republic. And we have been at the very forefront of this debate since its beginning, helping to establish the Scottish Independence Convention in 2005, the Radical Independence Campaign, and Yes Scotland in 2012. The SSP had a seat on the Yes Scotland Advisory Board during the referendum. In recognition of our important role we have played in advocating for Scottish independence over the last 25 years, and our continued constructive contribution played throughout the independence movement today. The SSP has continued to work with others in the Yes movement by encouraging our members to take part in their local Yes group, by engaging with the Scottish Independence Convention, by maintaining a presence at all of the All Under One banner marches, and through holding our own meetings and campaigns of Scottish independence, such as the one tonight. The referendum campaign saw the highest level of voter engagement in British history since universal suffrage. 97% of the Scottish population registered to vote, 330,000 of them for the very first time. And what motivated these Yes voters was the opportunity to use the establishment of a Scottish state to create a society which offered better opportunities for equality and for social justice than the current UK. The referendum campaign was not nationalistic. It was symptomatic of a much broader loss of faith in the ability of existing institutions to protect people from unaccountable power. The demand for independence was merely the form in which Scots chose to express that need, a need that was sweeping across the developed world, a need for the urgent necessity of a new politics of democratic accountability. For us on the left, the sentiments clearly expressed by the Yes movement, those of being anti-austerity, against nuclear weapons of mass destruction and illegal wars, for equality, democratic accountability, and openness to cultural diversity, were all clearly progressive in nature. An independent Scotland was to be created, not because of Scottish uniqueness or some cultural difference with us and the rest of the UK, but so that a new country and all of the structures that flow from that new country, such as a parliament and a written constitution, could be used to lift Scotland out of our current condition of neoliberal austerity. Even after Yes's defeat, this upswing in popular participation continued, with massive surges in membership across all of the Yes parties. The SSP gained 3 million new members overnight, the Greens 5 million, but the overwhelming majority joined the SNP, which at one point claimed to have 100,000 members. The impetus of the Yes campaign was not nationalistic, but a desire for social change, which was being expressed through a demand for self-determination. However, in defeat, it has become more nationalistic, and the masses who piled into the SNP have been largely curtailed into a both votes SNP gradualist approach, increasingly hostile to the diversity in this movement, and indeed hostile to the grassroots movement itself, little more than an electoral support machine for the SNP. However, others tonight will cover how and why this strategy has failed. Instead, I'm going to focus on why we socialists campaigned so hard for independence in 2014 and why we continue to do so. What is the socialist case for independence? Firstly, there's a matter of principle. Socialism is the extension of democracy into all aspects of societal life, into our workplaces and our economy. Socialism, therefore, is a fullest realization of the democratic project. Socialists should naturally support the extension of the franchise to the young, to the imprisoned, to the migrant, and support measures to take increased participation in elections and in trade unions. Socialists therefore must take very seriously any demand for greater democratic accountability, and Scottish independence is such a demand. Now, it is true that reactionary and anti-socialist elements can use campaigns for democratic sovereignty to divide the working class and to distract us from class politics with constitutional politics. However, that was not the nature of the 2014 independence referendum. whose demand for greater democratic control over Scotland was clearly linked to using that control to end austerity to the benefit of Scotland's working class majority. Along with principle, Socialist support for independence was also tactical. The reason that the British ruling class opposes independence so much is because it would reduce this once empire to a rump, forever altering its global position, and is very likely that the UK would lose its permanency in the UN Security Council. The lack of suitable sites in England means that an independent Scotland's rejection of Trident nuclear missiles would probably result in unilateral disarmament across the whole of the UK. Scotland's breakaway would have an ongoing consequence for the other nations of the UK, such as Wales and Northern Ireland. Scottish independence would start a chain of events throughout the world which are overwhelmingly positive. The retreat of Britain as an interventionist American fangirl and the final death of its foreign policy, still influenced by dreams of a long-dead empire. Now, Scotland is not a colonised or an oppressed nation. This is not a national liberation struggle like those experienced by apartheid South Africa, India, Palestine, or Ireland. Scotland, in fact, has been a willing participant in and a beneficiary of the British Empire. Yet us socialists understand that this is precisely because Scotland is part of the UK that allows Scotland to become an oppressor, a role which we disproportionately play a part in relation to our size. Without being part of the UK, Scotland would never be able to play such a significant part in interfering with the rest of the world, in being the world's watchdog, or hosting nuclear warheads for America. We campaign for an independent Scotland because the current devolved settlement will never be enough to implement socialist change. The Scottish Government will forever be able to blame Westminster for the Scottish Government's own political choice to pass on austerity. We have this same answer again and again when we're campaigning, whether it's on cuts to local authority budgets or in the gutting of further education. Scottish independence is about being able to have the power to raise the minimum wage to a real living wage of £12 an hour, to ban 0-hour contracts, and to introduce a minimum 16-hour contracts for all who want them, to repeal Thatcher and Blair's anti-trade union laws, to remove Trident from our shores, and to end the hostile environment for immigrants, and to welcome all of those who come to our depopulated land. But without the full control of independence, the Scottish Government cannot enact these demands. Scottish independence, for us, is also about creating a republic, ending the morbid spectacle that we have been treated to for this last month, the media obsession over the Kardashians with crowns and their every interpersonal drama. We see no place for an unelected, unaccountable, and unrepresentative head of state in a democracy. The British monarchy is a relic from a bygone age that should have been replaced an awful long time ago. The media and the political discussion around the monarchy is an insult to our intelligence. On the one hand, we're told the Queen has no powers, yet at the same time she is supposedly responsible for 69 years of political stability. We are advised that hers is a largely ceremonial role, and yet our MPs and MSPs still have to swear an oath of allegiance to her. She is the head of our judiciary, our police, and our armed forces. The truth is that the monarchy has considerable latent power. The Queen appoints the Prime Minister, the powerful Privy Councillors, the judges, the lords, and the bishops that make up our unelected second house. She is also the biggest landowner in Britain, with the Crown estates covering a vast area of our countryside and our shoreline, preventing that land's use for the common good. That is not to mention the myriad of lesser royals whose own vast personal estates cover much of the country. The royals also have an unhealthy and undemocratic relationship with our media. Good journalism and a free press are vital for a flourishing democracy. Yet the wall-to-wall media silence on the grand old nonce of York during the hours and hours of coverage we have been subjected to after Prince Philip's death is very telling. A commoner would be rightly tried over accusations of paedophilia, and yet Prince Andrew gets to go free, and our media stay dutifully silent. They go even so far as to crop every photo of the Queen sitting in the pew at Prince Philip's funeral, so it looked as if she was sitting on her own, when in fact just 2 seats away was Prince Epstein's best old pal, Andrew. The existence of a monarchy in a democratic country is a scandal and an insult to all those who value equality. Independence is also vital if we are to tackle the climate crisis that we are hurtling towards. Scotland has 25% of Europe's offshore wind potential and 10% of Europe's wave potential. Scotland also has North Sea oil and gas, and we must transition away from this fossil fuel industry to renewables as quickly as possible to prevent climate crisis. However, we must ensure that this transition is done in a way that benefits the existing energy workforce and the communities dependent on them. We cannot see a blighting of the North East in the same way that the Central Belt coalfield communities were. And the only way to ensure this is through the control given by democratic public ownership and by nationwide planning of the energy sector. The Scottish Government, as a devolved Parliament, may take into ownership the odd firm here and there, such as Abellio, but it's pretty unlikely that it will take a whole sector into public ownership. But when the excuse of Westminster says no is finally gone, the left in the independent Scotland would be able to be better positioned to push for such reforms. For these reasons, democratic accountability, for a republic, for the economic levers to end austerity, and to create a flourishing green job sector, we need an independent socialist Scotland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roisin. Roisin's outlined socialist arguments for independence, the limitations of devolution, and the importance of accountability and the democratic principle. She's also talked about some of the policies that we as socialists would want to see in an independent Scotland. She touched on the climate crisis too. We've got lots to say about what needs to be done to end the current climate emergency, and we'll be saying it loudly over the coming months in the run-up to COP26, with the powers currently devolved to Holyrood and with the powers we could have as an independent country. So look out for that. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook or Twitter, please share this live stream so that we can spread the progressive working class case for independence. And thank you for all the comments that we've received so far. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Gordon Martin, has been unable to join us tonight because of technical difficulties. Gordon Martin is the Scottish Regional Organiser for the RMT, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers. Gordon's standing for election to the Union's General Secretary role and has received the backing of our paper, the Scottish Socialist Voice, for his campaign. Despite last week's encouraging vote in the STUC in favour of a referendum, the RMT is the only major union in Scotland that supports independence, and it's therefore no coincidence that the RMT is a member-led fighting union and an important member of the Yes team. We'd like to wish Gordon all the best of luck with his bid for General Secretary, and we would also like to say that we stand in solidarity with the current strike of conductors and the RMT. We wish them the best of success in the future and hope that the strike will soon be won and over. We all know that mere promises of national self-determination are not enough for most people. We lost in 2014 because we didn't persuade enough people that they would be economically better off or even economically secure. We all remember the disasters over the pound, pensions and EU membership. There's never been a proper conversation in the independence movement about why we lost last time. The attempts to address this by the Alapa Party and the SNP leadership, with the aid of Andrew Wilson, have failed to produce a more persuasive case than the 2014 white paper. If anything, in fact, it's worse. We know that the Sustainable Growth Commission's promises of austerity and neoliberalism are not in the interests of working people, even if we're not the intended audience. Nicola Sturgeon said last week that she's still fully behind the approach taken in that document. She just thinks the numbers need to be updated. So how do we persuade a majority of Scots to support independence? Can we replace the negative arguments of the SNP's Sustainable Growth Commission and the EU Remainers with more inspiring ones about house building, universalism, high wages, and the end of austerity? It's now my pleasure to introduce Colin Fox, the other national spokesperson of the Scottish Socialist Party. Colin's a former SSP member of the Scottish Parliament and member of the Yes Scotland Advisory Board. Colin, how do we solve the problem of the Yes side's Achilles heel, the economy?
Well, that's a really good question, Shirley. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Shirley. That's a really important question. I first of all wanted to say welcome to everyone for the attending this really important Scottish Socialist Party rally on the case for an independent socialist Scotland and how it's to be achieved. And tonight we're going to consider not just the question that Shirley posed, but some fairly profound and crucial questions for the independence movement. As Roisin has just outlined there, the Scottish Socialist Party supports an independent socialist Scotland, a modern democratic republic, and we've been part of the independence movement for 25 years now. Indeed, our tradition that supports independence includes John Maclean, James Connolly, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, you can see behind me, who all stood for the rights of nations like Scotland to self-determination. And that support rests upon the conviction that Scotland's working class majority will be better off free from the economic, social and political straitjacket imposed upon us by the British state. So I've no intention of repeating the case. Roisin's made it more than eloquently. I want to take the case on further and pose a couple of questions to the rally. On the 6th of May, which is a week tomorrow, the SNP looks set to win another Holyrood majority, if the polls are correct. That's their 4th Holyrood majority in a row. Yet, on the other hand, under their leadership, the independence movement has stalled. There's no getting away from the fact. There was 2 opinion polls last week that should cause us some concern. For example, last week, Savanta Comres showed that support for independence has fallen by 10% since last June, from 58% to 48%. And a YouGov poll on Friday concluded that support for yes is as low as 39%, if don't knows are included. So yes was at 39%, no was at 45%. I think there was 10 or 15% included as don't knows. So tonight I want to focus my remarks, Shirley, if I can, focus the movement's attention on 2 primary questions facing the independence movement. Why is it, the first question, why is it we can't seem to persuade the majority of Scots of our case? And secondly, if the route to self-determination is via a second referendum, where is the strategy for surmounting the plain and obvious and unflinching opposition to that second referendum in a Section 30 order by the Westminster Parliament and the British state? These are profoundly important questions the independence movement needs to urgently consider. And I have to say, I intend, if I can, Shirley, to largely leave the second question about how we're going to overcome the opposition of Boris Johnson, Westminster, 600 out of 650 MPs. I want to leave that question to Liam, but I'm bound to say that the SNP leadership seems to me, far more content to keep kicking the can down the road, making neither a persuasive case for independence or providing a coherent strategy for achieving it, as long as they win elections. And I think these two issues demand our urgent attention. So let's speak frankly and make it clear that even if there is a majority of MSPs elected next Thursday who support independence from the SNP and the Greens, it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough unless there's a majority of the people in the country for independence. It's not enough to have a majority of independents supporting MSPs. We need an independence majority in the country. So what is the essential weakness in our case that impedes our ability to persuade our fellow Scots of its merits? And if, as I believe, it's the profound economic deficiencies in our argument, what are we as a movement going to do to address that? What is wrong with the economic case that we can't persuade people? And why is the SNP's message that Scotland's economy is essentially sound so patently counterproductive to the case for change? These are profound questions that I have to say, as an activist in the independence movement for decades, I see far too few people addressing. And they're right in front of us, and they're really, really important. So what does that persuasive economic case for independence look like? Well, it's not the one in front of us. It's not the one that says we keep the pound and we hand back control of monetary and fiscal policy to the UK state that we just voted to leave. That won't do. We need to also be better informed about the world we inhabit. The most important place to look, economically speaking, in Scotland today for lessons that an independent Scotland can learn is not other little countries like Denmark, Finland, and New Zealand, as the Sustainable Growth Commission mistakenly argued. It's from the world's biggest economy, China. That's where the lessons are. China's astonishing growth over the past 40 years offers far more valuable lessons for us. From being an impoverished third world country in 1980, they're now the world's largest economy. China, it's true, began with an abundance of cheap labour that we certainly don't have, but it was also quickly followed by massive investment in technological and economic development that's been described as the second and third Chinese revolution. Now, I'm not saying that an independent Scotland should or could even emulate every decision China has taken over the past 45 years. That would be silly. But neither can we reject them all. China's colossal investment in world-class infrastructure is something we could learn. The role of the state, the central role of the state, efficient economic planning is another lesson we can learn. An iron determination to achieve their ambition, which was to lift 800 million people out of absolute poverty. 800 million people. These are incredible achievements, and an independent Scotland needs to learn from and develop much closer economic ties with China. It's clear that Britain and the EU, for example, have spent the last 20 years in denial about Chinese economic miracles, where others weren't so blind. And the truth is that Scotland's economic picture today is one of low productivity, chronically low levels of investment, a historic failure to develop our nation's human potential, widening inequalities where millions are simply left behind, the privatization of profitable public services, industries and utilities, austerity and public spending cuts, a lack of ambition economically, an over-reliance in financial services, housing bubbles fueled by cheap credit, stock exchange speculation, and the suppression of all political and social resistance therein. That's something they have learned perhaps for China. And when you add that, Shirley, to the fact that the additional economic impact of COVID this last 18 months, the exponential increase in borrowing to unprecedented in peacetime, which will be paid back, make no bones about it, will be paid back through increased taxes, public spending cuts, and growth in the economy. Given the extent of that indebtedness, it'll probably involve all three, and it'll take a decade or more to do so. And that presumes, of course, that there's no any more lockdowns. or pandemics. So that brings us to the key question here, that the vision of independence held by the majority of Scots, the Scottish working class majority, the vision we have of independence demands profound improvement in the current and economic conditions that we face. Yet the SNP's innate conservatism holds us back. Their message is that little needs to change with independence. Nicola Sturgeon says, we'll keep the pound, we'll keep the Queen, we'll stay in NATO, we'll remain in the EU, we'll allow finance capital to continue to rule the roost under the hegemony of private ownership of capital. Well, I reject that message. That's not going to win as the case for independence. The economic and political case for independence must go hand in hand with the presumption of profound change, the rejection of this innate conservatism and managerialism of Nicola Sturgeon. Shirley mentioned that I sat in the Scottish Parliament for 4 years. Jack McConnell was the First Minister then. We've had 20 years of a Scottish Parliament run by managers. Donald Dewar's managerialism, Jack McConnell's managerialism, Alex Salmond's managerialism. Now we'll get Nicola Sturgeon's managerialism, managing capital in the interests of capital. And we have to say that Scotland's working class majority wants something completely different. And the economic case for independence must be grounded in their material needs. Nicola Sturgeon's argument is that Scotland's economy is essentially fine as it is, and that we can compete with any country in the world. Well, she's wrong. She could have been more wrong. Scotland's economy is weak and ill-prepared for the changes to come. Private ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange in Scotland is inefficient as well as exploitative. It stands for profit for the few. It's not democratic. It's not progressive in any regard. And it's my contention, Shirley, to this rally tonight, it's my contention the Scottish Socialist Party's role in securing independence for Scotland will be decisive. These indivisible elections we're having, I'm sure it's crossed people's mind. Must have seen it somewhere in the past, and the election's a week tomorrow. This invisible election has been exceedingly dull. In effect, it's become a referendum on Nicola Sturgeon's handling of the pandemic. The result is a foregone conclusion. I personally fear that the turnout will reflect all this next Thursday and sink below the 50% needed to make it democratically legitimate. Yet, whilst the result in May the 6th will change little, I see and recognise an independence movement that's increasingly frustrated by the SNP's conservatism. It's impatient with its tactical ineptitude. Scotland needs change, that much is clear. But what kind of change? Change for whom? Change in whose interests? These are the big questions that are increasingly coming to the fore inside the independence movement. And I see the Scottish Socialist Party, Shirley, making big gains in the months ahead and years ahead via the protest movements that are bound to crop up, progressive campaigning, parliamentary by-elections that the SNP will lose against that background, as people's impatience with their conservative managerialism boils over in precisely the same way it did with New Labour in the past. And I believe the Scottish Socialist Party can benefit from the new mood and from a serious approach to the challenges that I've put in front of this rally that our movement faces. In the months ahead, we'll lay out a much improved economic case for independence, as well as a much more coherent, democratic, extra-parliamentary based strategy for achieving it. The Scottish Socialist Party will make the case for an independent socialist Scotland, a modern democratic republic to working class urban Scotland, and instill in them the belief and self-confidence that it is us who and no one else who will deliver Scotland's independence. And I think the Scottish Socialist Party can look forward to exciting times ahead, forging an independence movement that's more mature, that faces up to the huge challenges we face, and recognise that we must overcome the forces of British capitalism and the British state if we are to secure our historic goal. So to those of you joining us tonight, if you've not already done so, join the Scottish Socialist Party, be part of that change, help us build that independent socialist Scotland and modern democratic republic that Scotland so much needs and requires. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. You gave us lots of food for thought there. I think we all know that managing and reforming capitalism is not what the SSP is about. The SSP is the only transformational political party on the go at the moment. And let's all just hope that you're right, and that the frustration of the independence movement will build into something much more positive, because there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Our last speaker is going to be Liam McLaughlin. Liam is a Scottish Socialist Party organiser in East Glasgow. He also sits on the party's executive committee. And in a moment, Liam's going to speak about the route map to Scottish independence. We've heard a lot about the need to win a majority for yes, that's obviously the priority, but the questions being raised now are, how do we get a referendum if Boris Johnson refuses to grant a Section 30 order? And do we even need a referendum to become independent? Liam, what are the answers?
Thanks, Shirley, and thank you to Roisin and Colin for their contributions, and a huge virtual welcome to everybody tuning in to tonight's broadcast. Now, if you'll allow me, Shirley, just for a wee moment there, although you had touched on it, just for those who perhaps haven't heard me speaking on party platforms, I just want to touch a wee bit on my background to independence campaigning. Now, in 2012, I got involved in the first political campaign I'd ever been involved in, which was, of course, the independence referendum. I was at that time a 16-year-old, and by the time of the vote in 2014, I was 18, had just left school, and had spent the majority of my last year at school using study periods to organise, by that point, what became a thriving branch of both the Radical Independence Campaign and also the SSP, and we were responsible for the creation and the implementation of what became a series of events known as mass canvasses for both RIC and with SSP input. And for anybody who's lucky enough to have heard me speak before, you probably have heard me mention this in the past, but right here where I'm sitting just now, Glasgow Province constituency, we had the highest proportion yes vote in Scotland at 57%. So that's just to touch on a kind of opening remarks on my record as an independence campaigner. And the reason why, Shirley, I wanted to touch on that is because much of my contribution here may or may not be seen as being slightly negative in its reflection of where the independence movement sits just now and what the current leadership of the SNP's strategy for taking us forward is. And so touching on that strategy for where we are just now in the SNP leadership, I think it is important that before I touch on later on in my contribution about our alternative proposals to that we properly evaluate and understand where we sit at the moment. And if attendees at tonight's rally could travel back in time with me here to 2017, well, Theresa May had just stepped foot into Downing Street as a newly anointed rather than elected Tory Prime Minister, working with a majority of 12 handed to her by her predecessor David Cameron, who was forced to resign in the aftermath of the loss of the Brexit referendum. That was a Prime Minister fundamentally weak, leading a divided party, split on an issue, EU membership, which had divided and disrupted the Tory party for the best part of 3 decades before. Faced with that reality, Nicola Sturgeon asked Theresa May for a Section 30 order in 2017 in the aftermath of that referendum to grant Scotland the powers in the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum within this parliamentary term that has just finished. Now, attendees of tonight's rally may or may not remember what Theresa May's response to that request was. It was a straightforward, simple no. Now is not the time, repeated ad nauseum in true Theresa May fashion. May's response further was to then call a snap general election in the summer of 2017 in an attempt to try and bolster her support within the Tory party and end her reliance on the right-wing Brexiteers that had caused so much havoc for so many Tory Prime Ministers before her. Now, of course, people will remember the outcome of that election. Theresa May, conversely, was then reliant on an even more reactionary right-wing group of sectarian bigots from Northern Ireland. And we were left in a situation in Scotland where the Tories increased their representatives in Scotland from 1 to 13, and combined alongside that in the DUP, somehow kept Theresa May clinging on to power. Now, faced with that reality of a Tory surge in Scotland and a campaign based solely on opposition to a second independence referendum, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP leadership faced a crossroads. They chose the easy way out. They chose to jump on board the Stop Brexit bus, putting all the energies and thoughts of the independence movement into a failed and ultimately flawed campaign to try and stop Brexit, and for what was termed at that time as a people's vote. A people's vote campaign used as a Trojan horse by the right wing of the Labour Party to undermine the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. That direction and that movement was epitomised by photos of Nicola Sturgeon on a Stop Brexit People's Vote rally. Who with? The creator of the dodgy dossier that led to the illegal invasion of Iraq and the death of 100,000 Iraqi civilians, Alistair Campbell. That's where the energies and efforts of the independence movement and the SNP were forced into in 2017 to 2019. So let's compare that situation to where we are now in 2021, faced with a Tory majority led by Boris Johnson of 80, a Tory party completely reliant and subservient to his political mandate that he received in last year's general election. Boris Johnson, the man who delivered Brexit, defeated Corbyn and then delivered the highest Tory majority seen since Thatcher. Do we really expect that now Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, even if in the event next Thursday that we have a pro-independence majority again in the Scottish Parliament, are going to be able to go in those circumstances and Boris Johnson is simply going to grant a referendum on that basis? That's the question that faces the movement just now. And people here at the meeting may also be aware, if they've watched the campaign develop over the last couple of weeks, that the SNP went into this campaign as independence was being key to our recovery from the COVID pandemic. We even had Ian Blackford talking about the possibility of a referendum in 2021 by the end of this year. Just recently, however, you may have noticed that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP have significantly rode back on that promise. We're now talking about 2023 at the earliest. Further yet again, kicking the can down the road. By 2023, Nicola Sturgeon will have been First Minister for almost a decade. And the questions that face the independence movement now, in that context, within the last decade, has there been any real progress? Is there a plan B? Has there been proper discussion and debate about where we're going as a movement and the big questions it faces as the political situation evolves and changes from what we faced in 2014? And I don't believe that if you answer that question fully, honestly, that you can come to the conclusion that the answer to any of them is anything other than no. And for me, our movement's greatest failure in 2014 was what happened in its aftermath. First of all, to rally around what was then one party in the SNP, and in the subsequent years, what has become rallying around one person, the leader of that party, and that is Nicola Sturgeon. So why the delay? Why 2023? And the answer for that is that really, if we're being honest, there is no real and substantial majority at the moment for independence. The support fluctuates for independence based on the political fortunes of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Now, consistent polls over the last 12 months have shown a majority support for independence, but it's based solely on Sturgeon's perceived better handling of the pandemic and, without doubt, better communication than Boris Johnson. But is that an independence majority that's built on anything that's there to last? For me, we need to be starting to build a real solid majority that can last and take us in to a referendum in the lifetime of this Parliament. Now, Colin referenced the two polls in the last week from Savanta Comrades and YouGov, which had independent support at 47 and 48%. And even more importantly for us in the movement, there was even less support for the idea of a second referendum anytime soon. And as I've mentioned before, that language change for independence being central to the recovery to now being almost an afterthought, that the recovery comes first and the referendum comes second. Now, the first and major priority for us as a movement is to ensure that there's a democratic majority in Parliament, not just for yes and for a referendum, but for independence. But even more importantly, that there's a majority in society for a referendum first and independence, of course, as well. Because without that, our case collapses at that point. It falls at the first hurdle. Now, why we don't have that after almost 10 years of an SNP government, after 4 national election wins for Nicola Sturgeon's SNP in 2015, 2016, 2017 and 2019. That's, for me, a damaging indictment on her leadership of the independence movement. Now, I think we need to be brutal and we need to be honest with ourselves. There's no chance at the present moment, as Colin had touched on, of Westminster granting us a referendum with a Holyrood majority alone. None. Zilch. And the current strategy about taking things down the legal route, the 1997 Scotland Act makes it clear where the power lies in that regard. Power devolved is power retained. Westminster is the ultimate say on whether or not the Scottish Parliament has the right to call a referendum. And the current SNP Plan B of what's termed a wildcat Catalan-style referendum, it'll have no legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, and the unionists here at home won't engage with it either. So where does that leave us, and what options do we have on the table? We need to force collectively Westminster into doing something that it simply does not wish to do, and that is grant us that Section 30 order. Now, what tactics and strategy do we need to take forward in order to secure that? Now, this isn't a binary choice about whether it's only parliamentary or extra-parliamentary pressure. Those two things can, and for me, should complement and help each other. Now, that only works, as I say, with an honest assessment of the arithmetic that faces us in that Parliament. And so it is my strong belief that the independence movement is soon going to come to another crossroads and face a huge choice about whether or not that we seriously take up strategies around civil disobedience. Now, this is a decision that can't be taken lightly. It's not the traditional method or traditional campaigning style in the UK or in Scotland, which, despite perhaps our misconceptions at times, is not quite as progressive as we like to think. The Sturgeon and the SNP leadership will bitterly oppose this. Why? Because ultimately it takes power and control of the movement out of their hands and into the hands of communities like here in Easterhouse, where I'm sitting, and the working class schemes of Dundee, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Stirling, Dumfries. That's the hotbed of independent support. That's where independence will be won and lost. These are the areas the 2014 campaign was built on, and these are the areas in which any prospective win for independence will be built on as well. Now, the single biggest example and most successful example of a civil disobedience campaign that worked was the mass non-payment of the anti-poll tax in the late 80s and early 90s. That brought down the Thatcher government. Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady who had smashed the miners, beat Argentina in the Falklands, and beat a Labour Party in 3 successive general elections, was brought down by a community-led campaign led by socialists and trade unionists in working class areas. The stakes here are high, but if the independence movement is serious about winning and winning soon, then these are the kind of tactics and approach that we're going to have to seriously engage with and build in the years to come. Our response needs to be as equally as serious and as high as the stakes that faces, because no more can we tolerate another 5 years of this, another 5 elections of pro-independence majorities, and yet the status quo remains. No longer can we accept an illegitimate Tory government led by Boris Johnson denying us the basic right, the basic fundamental democratic right to self-determination. And to steal a line from Colin back in the 2014 referendum, supporting Scotland's democratic right to self-determination doesn't make you a Scottish nationalist, it makes you a Democrat. And the responsibility for delivering a referendum in a lifetime in the next Parliament, and the responsibility for winning that referendum lies with us all. Let's ensure that by the time of the 2024 UK general election, Scotland's place as an independent, outward-looking, progressive nation is secure, a nation taking its first steps in the road to becoming a socialist republic that puts its working class majority at the centre of power and influence. Now that's a challenge that excites and motivates me in equal measure, and I look forward, and the SSP looks forward to joining and working with you all as we take the steps on that journey. Thank you.
Liam, for that very forensic analysis of the decline of the independence movement and the failure of the SNP to pursue independence. Obviously, we need to do more than just build a really good economic case and make a vision for possible change in our country. We probably will have to mobilise majority support for independence and organise possibly extra-parliamentary action against what's happened in the past. There aren't any easy answers, but I hope that after hearing our speakers, you'll agree that we do need to build working class power in workplaces and communities. We need a fight back that at the moment isn't taking place, as we've just heard, on a scale that's needed to defeat the UK state or capital, and one which unfortunately hasn't yet captivated public enthusiasm and support. That's the huge challenge for us, and it'll still be there after the election next week, regardless of the result, as we know. To help build a class struggle socialist party to spearhead the movement to win working class support, please join the Scottish Socialist Party now. There's a link in this video description. And if you'd like to get working class socialist perspectives from Scotland and around the world delivered to your inbox, please subscribe to the Scottish Socialist Voice. It's great value at £10 for 12 issues, and it's emailed straight to you every fortnight. Issue 557 is out now. In closing, I'd like to say thank you very much again to all our excellent speakers tonight, to Roisin McLaren, Colin Fox and Liam McLaughlin. I'd also like to thank Hugh Cullen, who's been working hard with the technical stuff behind the scenes. And comrades who've been attending, thank you very much to you too for coming along and taking the time to join us. We hope it's been useful and even interesting sometimes, and we look forward to seeing you all back out on the streets for campaigning and rallies very soon. We've heard some amazing analysis and encouraging as well as depressing thoughts tonight. But what we know we have to do is to wrestle back control of our movement from the politicians who only care about getting our votes once every 5 years. Let's fight for all of us to have a future worth living in. Let's win an independent, socialist Scotland. Good night.